I never said that. Trust me, I would never do that to you. I've been completely transparent about everything. That's not what happened at all. I love you and only you. Right now, someone in your life is lying to you. Not probably. Not possibly. Someone is lying to you right now, today. And the unsettling reality is that you almost certainly have no idea who it is or what about. Research across multiple studies consistently places human lie detection accuracy at roughly 54%, barely better than a coin flip. Which means that for all your intuition, all your experience reading people, all the confidence you have in your ability to sense when something is off, you are wrong about half the time. And the people who are most confident in their ability to detect deception, they are among the least accurate. But what if the problem is not your instincts? What if the problem is what you have been trained to watch for? For decades, every lie detection framework aimed at everyday people is focused on the same set of signals, the classic tells. Eye contact avoidance, touching the face, shifting weight, crossed arms, brief pauses before answering. These signals have been popularized by television shows, corporate training programs, and thousands of self-help books, promising to make you a human lie detector. There is one problem with all of them. Controlled research across more than 200 studies, examining over 20,000 judgments, found that none of these behavioral signals reliably indicate deception. Not one. The behavioral tells most people have been taught to watch for are essentially noise. Patterns that vary by culture, personality, anxiety level, and individual baseline behavior to a degree that makes them nearly useless as deception indicators. But while researchers were busy discovering what does not work, a quieter and far more powerful body of evidence was accumulating in a completely different direction. Not what liars do with their bodies, what they do with their words. Language does not lie as efficiently as behavior can be controlled. The conscious mind manages perhaps 5% of cognitive output. The remaining 95%, including the specific words selected, the grammatical structures employed, the degree of personal ownership embedded in a statement, operates largely beyond voluntary control. And that 95% leaks. What follows are not intuitions. They are not interpretations. They are empirically validated linguistic and psychological patterns, identified through computational analysis of thousands of deceptive statements across court testimony, political denial, business fraud, and interpersonal deception, that reveal the hidden architecture of a lie. 4 patterns, each one invisible to untrained attention, each one present in some combination in virtually every significant deception you will encounter. By the end of this, you will never hear language the same way again. Pattern 1. The disappearing self. When people lie, they unconsciously erase themselves from the story. This is not a deliberate strategy. It is a psychological reflex. The brain, sensing the moral weight of constructing a false narrative, attempts to create distance between the self and the statement. The mechanism is subtle. A shift from first person to third person. A replacement of I with we or one or passive constructions. A reframing of personal actions as circumstances that simply occurred. The honest person says, I made that decision and I stand by it. The deceptive person says the decision was made based on the information available at the time. Notice what happened. The agent disappeared. The decision, which required a human being to make it, now appears to have made itself. The passive construction creates a grammatical space between the speaker and the action, a space the speaker can retreat into when the lie is challenged. Consider how former U.S. President Richard Nixon described his administration's involvement in Watergate. I can say, categorically, that this investigation indicates that no one on the White House staff, no one in this administration presently employed, was involved in this very bizarre incident. Parse that sentence carefully. The investigation indicates, not I found. No one presently employed, a caveat that technically excludes anyone who had already left. Nixon does not say we did not do this. He constructs a grammatical labyrinth in which he is simultaneously present and absent, simultaneously asserting and hedging. Contrast this with honest, direct communication, which almost always centers the speaker as the agent of their own statements. The more someone is removing themselves from their own sentences, the more carefully you should listen to what those sentences are actually claiming. But the disappearing self is only the first layer, because alongside the grammatical erasure of the self, something equally revealing is happening in the emotional register of the language. Pattern 2, the emotional leak. Liars feel guilty. Even practiced, sociopathic liars, those who feel the least conscious guilt, show measurable shifts in emotional language when their statements are analyzed at scale. But for the majority of human beings engaged in significant deception, the guilt is substantial. And guilt does not stay where you put it. It leaks into the language surrounding the lie, not in the central deceptive claim itself, which the conscious mind is carefully monitoring and constructing, but in the peripheral language, the adjectives chosen, the interjections used, the qualifications applied to statements that do not logically require them. Research in computational linguistics has identified a consistent pattern. Deceptive statements contain significantly more negative emotional language in the surrounding context than truthful ones about the same events. The classic example is the unnecessarily burdened excuse. Sorry, my stupid phone battery died. I hate that thing. The claim, phone battery died, does not require emotional loading. The battery dying is a neutral event. The addition of stupid and I hate that thing is the guilt looking for somewhere to go. The subconscious is managing its own discomfort by directing it at an object that is safe to criticize. Watch for emotional language that seems disproportionate to its target. The person who describes their business partner's decision with unusual bitterness. The spouse who becomes oddly contemptuous of something irrelevant while explaining a suspicious absence. The manager whose explanation for a decision includes unexplained hostility toward a process or system that has nothing to do with the core claim. The negativity is not about what it appears to be about. It is the psychic cost of lying, and it has to go somewhere. There is another dimension to this emotional leak that researchers have found even more diagnostically precise. In authentic emotional narratives, stories based on genuine experience, the emotional content is proportional and distributed. Pain occurs where pain is appropriate. Relief occurs where relief is appropriate. The emotions track the events. In constructed narratives, stories built rather than remembered, the emotional distribution is flatter and then suddenly spiked. Flat where the construction requires effort. Spiked where the emotional loading is being performed rather than reported. The liar's narrative sounds like someone reading stage directions rather than reporting experience. The emotional beats feel placed rather than embedded. Once you hear this distinction, you cannot unhear it. Pattern 3, the simplified universe. The human brain can retrieve a genuine memory with minimal cognitive effort. The temporal lobe retrieves the stored experience. The hippocampus provides contextual detail. And the narrative assembles itself from actual stored material. Building a lie requires the opposite process. The brain must construct a plausible reality that never existed, must generate details, maintain internal consistency, manage the story's relationship to verifiable external facts, and simultaneously monitor the listener's response for signs of disbelief. This is an enormous cognitive load. And under significant cognitive load, the brain simplifies. The result is what researchers call reduced complexity in deceptive narrative. Lying stories have fewer specific details, fewer embedded perspectives, fewer causal explanations, and fewer spontaneous corrections than truthful ones. They feel thin. They answer the question, posed and stop. They do not generate the peripheral texture that authentic memory produces involuntarily. Aristotle understood this centuries before neuroscience had language for it. Genuine wisdom and genuine experience naturally generate complexity. The real always has more edges than the constructed. Bill Clinton's famous statement, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky," is a masterwork of strategic simplification. The claim is maximally simple and maximally specific to a single definitional interpretation of sexual relations. It addresses the narrowest possible version of the question being asked, while technically leaving an enormous amount unaddressed. Simple, specific, strategically reduced. But the complexity reduction in significant deception goes beyond just strategic minimalism. It also appears in what researchers call reduced sensory specificity. Genuine memories are encoded with sensory detail. What the room smelled like, the exact words used in a specific exchange, the physical sensation of the moment. Constructed memories have generic sensory context or none at all. Ask someone to describe the circumstances of an event they are being honest about. The honest person generates unsolicited sensory detail. The color of the shirt someone was wearing, the specific song playing, the quality of the light. The constructed account provides logistical summary without sensory embedding. This pattern is why experienced interrogators ask questions designed not to probe the main claim, but to activate peripheral sensory memory. The truthful person can answer those peripheral questions richly. The liar cannot, because the peripheral detail was never stored, because the experience never occurred. The world a liar describes is a world with the texture stripped out. It is a world populated by events rather than experiences. Once you know what genuine experiential complexity sounds like, the stripped version is jarring. Pattern 4. The elaborate container. Here is the paradox that confounds most people's instincts about lying. Liars keep the central deceptive claim simple, as we have just established. but they construct the container around it with unusual elaboration. The sentences surrounding the lie become longer, more convoluted, more densely packed with technically accurate but irrelevant information. This appears counterintuitive. If someone is lying, why would they say more? The answer is cognitive and psychological. The simple lie, standing alone, creates a silence around itself, a space that the listener's expectation naturally fills with follow-up questions. The unconscious liar's solution is to fill that space preemptively, to create the appearance of comprehensive disclosure by surrounding the simple central claim with a dense thicket of accurate peripheral detail. The peripheral detail is often technically true. The dates are accurate. The procedural facts check out. The chronological sequence is correct. But the elaborate container is not the same as a complete account. It is a magician's misdirection, drawing the eye to the complicated truth while the simple central lie remains unexamined. John Edwards, during his denial of fathering his former campaign staffer's child, produced a statement of remarkable convoluted elaboration. I only know that the apparent father has said publicly that he is the father of the baby. I also have not been engaged in any activity of any description that requested, agreed to, or supported payments of any kind to the woman or to the apparent father of the baby. Count the cognitive obstructions in that passage. I only know that the apparent father has said publicly. 3 layers of hedging before the central claim. Any activity of any description that requested, agreed to, or supported payments of any kind. A legal formulation dense enough to confuse even a trained reader about what precisely is being denied. Edwards never says, "I am not the father." He says something that is technically consistent with not being the father, while constructing a grammatical architecture elaborate enough to prevent the listener from easily isolating what he has and has not actually denied. Contrast that with his eventual admission. "I am Quinn's father. I will do everything in my power to provide her with the love and support she deserves." 14 words, no hedging, no elaboration, no passive construction. The truth does not need a container. One of the most reliable signals of significant deception is the appearance of a simple central claim surrounded by an unusually elaborate explanatory structure. The honest person answers the question and stops. The deceptive person answers the question and then keeps going and going and going. Watch for statements that seem to be providing extensive context, extensive qualifications, and extensive procedural detail, while somehow never quite saying the specific thing the question actually asked. Applying the 4 patterns. 3 case studies in linguistic deception. These 4 patterns, the disappearing self, the emotional leak, the simplified universe, and the elaborate container, are most powerful when applied in combination. A single pattern is suggestive. 2 or more patterns appearing together in a single statement elevates the probability of deception significantly. Let us apply the framework to 3 real cases and see what the language reveals that the behavior did not. Case Study 1. Lance Armstrong, 2005. When Armstrong denied taking performance-enhancing drugs in his 2005 interview, his language exhibited each of the 4 patterns with almost clinical precision. On the disappearing self, okay, a guy in a Parisian laboratory opens up your sample, Jean-Francis so-and-so, and he tests it. And then you get a phone call from a newspaper that says, "We found you to be positive 6 times for EPO." The entire account is constructed in the second person. Your sample, you get a phone call. Armstrong has not just removed himself from the statement. He has replaced himself with a generic hypothetical you, creating maximum psychological distance from an accusation he knew to be accurate. On the elaborate container, the statement is densely packed with irrelevant geographic specificity. In a Parisian laboratory, anonymous characterization, Jean-Francis so-and-so, procedural detail about sample testing and media attribution, all of which surrounds the central non-denial with enough material to obscure what has and has not actually been said. On the simplified universe, Arms never, in that statement or in any of his denials, provides the experiential texture of genuine innocence, the specific outrage, the concrete alternative explanation, the sensory specificity of remembering exactly where he was when the accusation reached him. 8 years later, in his admission, "I lost myself in all of that." I'm sure there would be other people that couldn't handle it, but I certainly couldn't handle it. And I was used to controlling everything in my life. I controlled every outcome in my life. The self returns. First person dominates. Emotional language is personal and proportional. The experience has sensory and psychological texture, the simple complexity of honest confession. Quantitative analysis of the 2 statements found that his use of first-person pronouns increased by nearly 3/4 between the denial and the admission. Case Study 2. Elizabeth Holmes Theranos. Elizabeth Holmes, founder of the blood testing company Theranos, spent years making claims about her technology that investigators later determined were systematically false. Her public statements in the period of the fraud provide a textbook demonstration of the elaborate container pattern. In a 2014 interview, "What we've built is fundamentally based on the principle that every patient deserves access to high-quality, accurate, and timely information. And that means that we can make an impact not just on diagnostics, but on the entire healthcare system." The statement is built almost entirely from non-falsifiable general principles: high quality, accurate, and timely, impact on the entire healthcare system. Every specific technical claim that a journalist or regulator might verify has been replaced by aspirational abstraction. The disappearing self is also present. What we've built rather than I built. We can make an impact rather than specific technical specifications. The self is diffused into the collective we, and then further diffused into abstract organizational capability. When asked about specific technical details that would require concrete, accurate information, Holmes's statements consistently demonstrated the simplified universe pattern, providing procedural summary without the technical texture that genuine expertise generates spontaneously. Case Study 3. A pattern you may have heard this week. The 3 case studies above involve famous figures whose deceptions have been publicly confirmed, but the 4 patterns are not limited to high-stakes public denial. Think about the last time someone gave you an explanation that felt somehow unsatisfying without your being able to identify why. Think about the explanation that was very detailed about the wrong things. The account that never quite said the specific thing you were actually asking about. The emotional loading that seemed misplaced. Too much hostility toward an irrelevant detail. Too much elaboration around a claim that should have been simple. Apply the 4-pattern framework retrospectively. Was the self present or absent in the account? Did the emotional language track the events proportionally, or did it leak into unexpected corners? Was the central claim surrounded by unusual elaboration? Did the experience have sensory texture, or was it stripped to logistical summary? The framework does not deliver verdicts. It does not tell you someone is lying. It tells you that the language of a statement is exhibiting patterns that, in controlled research, correlate with deception, and that this correlation warrants more careful attention and more direct questioning. The counterintelligence. What honest language actually sounds like. Understanding the 4 patterns of deception is only half the framework. The other half is understanding what genuine honesty sounds like linguistically. Because the most important calibration is knowing the baseline before you start reading for deviation. Honest language is characterized by what researchers call high-agency first-person construction. The honest person is grammatically present in their own statements. They say, "I decided," not "it was decided." They say, "I don't know," not "the situation is complex." They own their uncertainty as directly as they own their certainty. Honest language is also characterized by proportional emotional distribution. The emotional content of a genuine account maps onto the events being described, not spilling over into the surrounding context, not loading onto targets that have nothing to do with the central claim. Honest language generates spontaneous specificity. The genuine account produces peripheral detail without being asked. Sensory texture, temporal sequence with specific markers, physical context that was incidental to the events, but stored because all genuine experiences are stored with context. The honest person remembers what they were wearing. The honest person remembers who else was there. The honest person's account has edges, places where they acknowledge uncertainty about peripheral details while being precise about central ones. An honest language is direct about its central claims. Not simple. Complex events generate complex descriptions, but direct. The central claim is stated rather than surrounded. The answer to the question is in the first sentence, not constructed through a labyrinth of qualifying clauses. Seneca understood this. Omnia aliena sunt, tempus tantum nostrum est. Everything else is borrowed. Time, and we might add truth, belongs only to us. The person speaking their genuine truth does not need elaborate architecture to contain it. The stakes. Why this matters. The 4 patterns of linguistic deception are not academic curiosities. They are practical tools that apply to every domain where human communication carries consequence. In professional contexts, in negotiations, in due diligence conversations, in performance reviews, in partnership discussions, the ability to identify linguistic deception patterns provides an informational advantage that most people will never have. Not because the information is secret, but because most people are trained to watch the wrong signals. The experienced investor who notices that a founder's claims about their technology are constructed predominantly in passive voice that the company achieved results rather than we built and validated them is accessing information that the investor watching for eye contact will miss entirely. The manager who notices that an employee's explanation of a failure demonstrates the elaborate container pattern. Extensive detail about peripheral factors surrounding a curiously simple and unspecific account of the central failure. Has information that a lie detector cannot provide. In personal relationships, the stakes are higher still. The partner who is present and first personal in their direct communication, but who becomes vague, passive-constructed, and emotionally misaligned when discussing specific times and places, is providing linguistic information that deserves serious attention regardless of the behavioral signals. But here is the critical qualification that separates this framework from the pop psychology of lie detection. These patterns are indicators, not proof. They are signals that suggest the possibility of deception and warrant deeper inquiry, more direct questioning, more specific requests for verifiable detail, more careful attention to internal consistency. They are not verdicts. The person who is highly anxious, or who is a non-native speaker managing a second language, or who is describing a genuinely traumatic experience they are struggling to articulate, may exhibit some of these patterns without any deceptive intent. Context matters, baseline matters. The framework is a tool for directing attention, not for replacing judgment. Use it to ask better questions, not to deliver premature conclusions. The practical framework, how to listen now. So how does this apply to the conversations you will have today and tomorrow and next week? First, and this is the most important single shift, stop watching and start listening. The behavioral signals research has comprehensively debunked are all visible. They direct your attention to the body. The linguistic patterns that actually correlate with deception are all auditory. They require you to be genuinely listening to the words being used, the grammatical constructions being chosen, the emotional register of the language relative to the content. Most people, in conversations where they suspect they might be being deceived, increase their visual attention. They watch more carefully. The research says the opposite is required. Close your eyes if you can. Listen for the patterns rather than looking for the tells. Second, listen for the self. In any significant account of personal action or experience, the speaker should be grammatically present. First person singular, in active construction, owning the decisions and experiences being described. When the self disappears, when events begin to happen without agents, when passive constructions multiply, when collective we replaces individual I, pay closer attention to what is not being directly claimed. Third, map the emotional content. Does the emotional language track the events? Or does it appear disproportionately in the surrounding context, loading onto irrelevant details while the central claim is emotionally flat? The misalignment between emotional content and event content is one of the most reliable signals in the framework. Fourth, listen for the container. The elaborate construction around a simple claim is the most diagnostically precise of the four patterns in face-to-face communication. When someone provides extensive, accurate context around a curiously brief and unspecific central claim, when the peripheral details are vivid and the core account is thin, ask directly about the core, not the periphery, the core. Finally, calibrate against the baseline. Before you apply these patterns to a specific statement, listen for the speaker's normal linguistic patterns. Some people naturally use passive construction. Some people naturally speak with high emotional loading. The patterns are most diagnostic when they represent a departure from the individual's linguistic baseline, not when they represent a general personality tendency. Research across deception studies consistently shows that the most accurate lie detectors are not the most suspicious people. They are the most careful listeners, people who pay genuine attention to the specific language being used, rather than relying on general impressions and intuitive snap judgments. That careful listening is a skill. It is buildable, and once built, it is extraordinarily difficult for deception to defeat. The most important thing this framework teaches. Before we apply these patterns to the conversations ahead of us, let us sit with the most important thing this research reveals. The four patterns exist because lying is cognitively expensive, because the human mind, even under the deliberate intention to deceive, cannot fully control the language it produces, because the gap between the conscious construction of a false narrative and the unconscious processes that generate language is wide enough for the truth to leak through. That leakage is in a deep sense encouraging, not because it makes deception impossible, clearly it does not, but because it means that at some level, even the committed liar is not entirely comfortable in the lie. The guilt leaks, the self retreats, the construction elaborates, the texture thins. The truth is heavier than the lie. and that weight shows up in language. This also means something important about how you present yourself. The 4 patterns that identify deception are also the inverse map of credibility. The person who speaks with consistent first-person agency, who is present in their own language, whose emotional content maps proportionally onto their claims, whose central statements are direct and whose complexity is authentic rather than constructed, is perceived as credible, not as a performance, but as a consequence of genuine honesty. You cannot perform the linguistic signatures of truth consistently. The conscious mind controls too little of the output for sustained performance, but you can cultivate them through the practice of genuine clarity, by knowing what you mean before you speak, by owning your uncertainty as directly as your certainty, by giving the people you speak with direct access to the actual claim rather than an elaborate container around it. The language of deception is ultimately the language of a mind at war with itself, and the language of honesty, direct, first-personal, proportionally emotional, specifically textured, is the language of a mind at peace. So how can you apply what you now know? Remember that most deception you encounter daily is far less consequential than the famous cases we examined, and much of it is harmless social lubricant that keeps interactions functioning. Not every passive construction indicates fraud, but keep the 4 patterns as a listening framework for the conversations that genuinely matter. Watch for the disappearing self, the person who is absent from their own account. Listen for the emotional leak, the negativity that loads onto irrelevant targets while the central claim is flat. Notice the simplified universe, the account that is thin where genuine memory would be textured, and pay close attention to the elaborate container, the extensive surrounding detail that keeps orbiting a curiously unspecific central claim. These 4 patterns, used with appropriate calibration and honest epistemic humility, will not make you infallible. They will make you significantly more accurate than the 54% that most people manage. They might also help you avoid the overvalued promise, the misleading contract, the compromised relationship, and the expensive cost of discovering the deception only after the damage is done.